Well, it's November in a year prior to a legislative session, and traditionally we use this membership meeting time frame to conduct after the elections a legislative meeting in Austin with all of our public officials and some of the chamber representation from a business perspective. And as a result, the typical process has been, like everything else this year, screwed up. So in lieu of doing that, where we put a legislative agenda together and get together and all kind of discuss this, and Ross or Evan Smith generally is part of that process to give us some feedback on what's going on in Austin from their perspective, from the Texas Tribune. We're going to have to do that differently this year. So we've constructed a legislative agenda in collaboration with all the chambers and the public entities as well. We've discussed this with some of the cities and some of the county officials relative to some things that were very important, not ubiquitously important for the government officials, but there's some pretty important things on there. And that's been presented to our legislators and will be presented to our legislators, and we'll be getting together on December 8th as part of this, and all of you are invited, as well as all of the chamber's membership are invited to attend a session that's going to have both senators and our state representatives on that morning. So look forward to that on information on Tuesday, December 8th, where we'll have a very significant discussion with our legislative group that represents Fort Bend County. And as part of that process, we always kind of during a lunch or an evening session have the Texas Tribune, Ross Ramsey, come and talk to us. He has a long background in politics, obviously. He's the executive editor and co-founder of the Texas Tribune. Before joining the Tribune, Ross was editor and co-owner of the Texas Weekly for 15 years, and he did a 28-month stint in government as Associate Deputy Controller for Policy and Director of Communications with the Texas Controller of Public Accounts. Before that, he reported for the Houston Chronicle from its Austin bureau and for the Dallas Times-Herald, first on a business desk in Dallas and later in Austin at bureau chief. And then he worked as a Dallas-based freelance business writer in a regional and national magazines and newspapers. He got his start in journalism and broadcasting, covering news for radio stations in Denton and Dallas. So Ross, without further ado, I'm going to let you take it, and then I'd ask everybody to go to speaker view and mute, please. And we'll have questions afterwards if we have time. Ross?
Jeff, thank you very much for having me back. I really appreciate it. It either is a sign of confidence or of a short memory on your part. Either way, I'm glad to be here. Good to see you guys this morning. Wanted to talk a little bit about the election that we just got out of, and with a view toward what that means to some extent for the legislative session that's supposed to start in January. And so I'll begin with November 3rd. We kind of had in Texas two different elections. If you look at the very top of the ballot, the presidential race was a 6-point race. Donald Trump won it. And it behaved a little bit differently than the other statewide races. If you go from John Cornyn on down the ballot through Railroad Commission, Supreme Court, Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, all of those candidates won by 8 to 11 points. So I think that's the normal Republican margin. If you're looking back at 2020 and saying, how red was Texas? It's about 10 points red, which is pretty healthy. It's smaller than it was in the middle of the last decade, but that's still a pretty healthy lead. And I think, the first takeaway from this race is Texas remains a red state, even when turnout is huge. The Democrats have been working on this slogan, really. It was more a slogan than a strategy, that Texas is not a red state, it's a non-voting state. Well, now it's a voting state and it's still red. So that's kind of the baseline that we've got here. The presidential race was a little bit more about the personality of the president. And if you looked at the numbers behind the election and said, do you like Donald Trump? Do you not like Donald Trump? People were really emphatic on both sides. So the people that liked the president really, really like him. This is important for a couple of reasons. If you have ever wondered why people like John Cornyn or Ted Cruz stay in line so carefully with the president, nobody wants to get crossways with Donald Trump, it's because Donald Trump and Republican voters are very tightly aligned. The voters are very loyal to him. And if you're another Republican office holder, you cross the president at the risk of crossing with your voters. So, a lot of them step very carefully, and you certainly see that in the days since the election, as the president has talked about and challenged some of the results in some of the states. There's a lot of quiet Republicans out there. Only, I think, one instance where they've bucked up a little bit was the president said he wanted to pull troops out of Afghanistan and the Middle East. And the Republican leadership, particularly in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, some others, immediately jumped up and said, don't do that. That's against America's interests. That's a very rare case, which is why it's even notable. So I think the stamp of this election is it affirmed Texas as a red state for now. In fact, it affirmed Texas as a red state for a while. This was the worst time possible for the Democrats to lose a big election. They were trying to get 9 more seats in the Texas House, which would have given them their first majority since the 2002 elections. And what they were really trying to do, other than just have a veto on all legislation, was to have a veto on redistricting legislation. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But, whoever is in the majority in the coming legislative session is going to draw the maps for the Texas House, the Texas Senate, the congressional delegation, and the State Board of Education, potentially for the next 10 years. So you can institutionalize the majority that you won on November 3rd. And now all of that is in the hands of the Republicans. So a very consequential election that way. The Democrats, there's a lot of conversation going on in the political class, frankly, in the media, about the quality of polling and what's going on with that. The polls were pretty consistently they tilted toward Democrats, and there's a lot of conversation about why that is. One string of theories is that Democrats have been more willing than Republicans. Democratic voters have been more willing than Republicans to answer polls. There's obviously something going on because a lot of the polls were wrong and in the same direction. You would expect in a normal course of things for polls to be kind of all around the correct answer. That's what the margin of error is. But they tended to be to the left of the correct answer. And the Trump strength in the electorate was stronger as it was in 2016 and 2020. So the president did well, the statewide Republicans did well, and Republicans did well in down ballot contests. If you're a Democrat and you're looking for good news here, one piece of interesting news to this election was that the 2018 election was a big year for Texas Democrats. They won 12 seats in the Texas House. They won a couple in the Texas Senate. They took a couple of places in the congressional delegation. Some of those are seats nobody expected them to take. And while they didn't win any seats in this election, they won 1 seat in the Senate this time. But while they didn't really win seats in this election, they didn't lose seats. So there was something of a reset in the numbers. The Texas House before the election had 83 Republicans, 67 Democrats. In January, it looks like it's going to have 83 Republicans and 67 Democrats, kind of same as it ever was. So that's a quick look at the election. If you look at the voters for a moment, there was a huge amount of turnout. We had a record turnout for Texas, and the percentage turnout was back up where it used to be back in the early 90s. And so, that's a hopeful sign if you're looking at civic engagement. A lot of people voted. A lot of people still didn't vote, but I think the last number I saw was 65% of the state voted. Those aren't solid numbers yet until it's certified, but that's a really good turnout in Texas. So some good news there. Suburbs continue to be a really interesting trend line in Texas politics. You guys are sitting in one of, what the political people consider the most volatile suburbs. It used to be that the Republican strategy for Texas was based on you win rural Texas. If you've ever looked at a map of an election in Texas, it looks like a big Texas-shaped bowl of tomato soup with some blueberries in it. And all of that red area, you count on that first. you know that you're probably going to lose. If you're a Republican, you're probably going to fall behind in Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth. I should say Dallas, and lately Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, the big cities. But you make it up in the suburbs. In the Dallas area, that's Rockwall, Collin, Denton. Tarrant County is a weird sort of hybrid. It's urban with Fort Worth, but the non-Fort Worth parts of Tarrant County are very similar politically to suburban areas. So that one's kind of a hybrid. Hayes and Williamson County around Dallas, and it used to be Montgomery and Fort Bend County around Houston. Montgomery is still reliably very Republican, but Fort Bend County is, you know, either blue or very purple at this point. And you guys have watched it progress or regress, depending on your point of view, over the years. It's a changing environment, and it means that the politics in Texas are changing. Not that they're necessarily becoming more democratic. You just had a 10-point race, but it does mean that the pitch that candidates have to make and the conversation that they have to have with voters is much different than it was 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago. And the Republicans and the Democrats are watching movement and volatility in those suburban areas. One of the common ideas is that, well, we've got all these Californians moving here. And if you talk to demographers, we do have a lot of people moving into the state, but we also have a lot of what they call natural increase, which is people having babies. More than half of the growth in Texas has been natural increase. And so, you know, these are homegrown Texans, and the demographics of Texas are changing fairly rapidly. If you look at, you know, the regular, if you look at adults who vote, you might see more Anglos there and more white people there than you do if you look at the enrollment in public schools. And the enrollment in public schools, those demographics are the future demographics. So a lot is changing in Texas. I think one of the interesting things in this election was it's false, but it's become kind of standard form to say Hispanics sort of naturally vote for Democrats. You know, the truth is that Democrats usually get 55 to 65% of the Hispanic vote. But if you increase the number of voters, if you bring in new Hispanic voters, or you get, you know, what have been called low propensity voters to vote, they don't necessarily vote the same way as the Hispanics who are voting. And we saw that in some of these border counties this time as the numbers of voters increased. Republicans did a little bit better. There was obviously a swell of support for Donald Trump. These are small number counties, but they're sort of interesting to watch. So, you know, one that got a lot of attention was Zapata County. The New York Times came down and did a story there. I think Zapata County's voter rolls are actually smaller than the size of the high school that I went to. But it's interesting because it was a blue county for a long time, and it illustrates what's going on in some places on the border. They voted for Trump, and they've been blue forever, and everybody went down there to see what the heck was going on. And it turned out that overwhelmingly Hispanic county voted like a rural Texas county with some oil in it. And, you know, you remember Joe Biden talking about energy and fracking, and in a way that wasn't really widely accepted in the oil field. They voted like all that red Texas. So there are a lot of things to take apart in this election. The big takeaway is that we're still in a Republican state. We've got a Republican legislature, Republican state officials, and we're going to have that for some time, I think. Before I leave elections completely, I want to say, this is going to make you put your head in your hands, that the 2022 elections have already sort of started in Texas. People are beginning to position themselves for statewide offices that'll be on the ballot. We don't have a Senate race in 2 years. We do have governor, lieutenant governor, and all the other statewide positions. And there are a bunch of Republicans who have been in statewide office, not in the top office, but in the middle offices, who are supportive of Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick, and also wondering when those chairs are going to be empty and when they can move along. They're ambitious people. So there's a lot of movement around that. There's a lot of movement around the Attorney General right now, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you're going to start pretty quickly seeing people do things that don't make sense unless you're thinking about what those people are doing in 2022. So something to look at. Joe Jaworski from Galveston, the former mayor down there, has already declared as a Democrat for Attorney General. George P. Bush, who's the state's land commissioner, was asked if he's looking at attorney general. He said, well, I'm not looking at it. I'm looking at everything. Enough to everybody think that he was still kind of in it. Somebody asked Matthew McConaughey yesterday if he wanted to run for governor, and he said, he didn't say no. I'll put it that way. So that's a subject of conversation. You can, we had a lot of celebrity politics. I suspect with the success of some of the celebrities in politics that we'll probably see more. I don't know if we'll see McConaughey, but that conversation has already started. Right after the election, we started the race for speaker. There was a period during the run up to the election. Dennis Bonnen, the current speaker, is not running for re-election, or didn't run for re-election. So he'll be out in January. Ordinarily, you would see the House start to sort of gin up a race for the replacement well before an election. In fact, when Bonnen won the speakership 2 years ago, the run up to the election, there were 10 or 12 candidates in the race officially before the election took place. This time, because the Democrats were very successful in making a lot of noise about taking over the House and had a lot of people, including on the Republican side, sort of hesitating about who would be in control of the legislature after the election. A lot of people who would otherwise have jumped into the race didn't jump into the race. But once we knew this was a Republican legislature, within about 36 hours, we knew who the speaker was. Dade Phelan, who's a Democrat from Beaumont, has the support of a supermajority of the Republicans and of the Democrats. He's taking a little flack from the chairman of the Texas Republican Party for having Democratic support. That's how the Texas House works. So Dade Phelan is on his way to the top chair. The way this works is the legislature will come in on the second Tuesday of January. First three orders of business are, first you swear them in, then they pass a set of rules, and then they elect a speaker, and then they disappear for a period while the speaker's organizing the House, putting together the lists of people who are going to be on this committee or that committee, who's going to chair this or that, all of this sort of stuff. So it seems like a fairly dormant period at the beginning of the session. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, but I expect, we'll get a big bang at the beginning of January and then kind of quiet for a while. There's actually been some talk of bringing the legislature in, doing those three things, and basically sending them home for 20 or 30 days while the speaker is getting things together so that they're not all stuck in a room infecting each other. Doing legislative activity during a pandemic is problematic. If you look at states around the country, they've got all kinds of different kinds of solutions. Some of them meet in bigger halls, they rent a convention center or something. There's been some conversation in Austin about that. I don't know how serious it will turn out to be. But if you just look at the building that they're in, it's like a social networking machine. This is built for people to get together and talk and argue and debate and, whisper to each other and do all of the things governments do. When the Texas Capitol is up and running during a legislative session, there are about 6,000 people in the building. And you can't put 6,000 people in there now. If you just look at the chambers, the Senate has 31 members, probably 30 staff members who are there at all times, and it's a really big room. So you could probably hold a Senate session in the current Senate chamber and socially distance everybody. The House looks like a fire ant mound. It's got 150 members. There's probably 50 staffers or more in the room at a time. The gallery is usually packed with people, and there's no way to do that and keep everybody distanced. So they've talked about everything from closing the galleries, which are usually for the public, for lobbyists, people like that, and moving some of the members up into the galleries so that they can spread out the ones who are left on the floor, spread out the ones who are in the galleries. The obvious problem with that is that you would be holding a legislative session without any public input or attention. We could watch it like we're watching each other right now. It's somehow not the same. And that's actually the easiest part of putting the legislature back in the building. If you can get the House to meet and the Senate to meet, that's great. It's more important at the end of the session than at the beginning. You can lock that down. The real problem, if you've been in the Capitol, I know most of you have, is that you get down in those narrow hallways and those tight committee rooms where there are crowds of people, And that's really how the system functions. You get a bunch of public input on things. You get a long line of witnesses on certain bills. The members work. Everybody is kind of in this giant mosh pit down there. The two kind of central gathering places are the Capitol cafeteria and a clock that hangs in a big hallway in the extension, where you can always find a clot of people kind of talking about what's going on. That particular fishing hole is a great place for reporters to hang out. And those kinds of things aren't going to work here. So you have to figure out, how do you hold public hearings? How can you hear from the public? How do you run witnesses in and out of a room? How do you line up the witnesses? Where do you hold them while they're waiting to come into the room? There's a million problems. Oklahoma's legislature, if you call it up in Google and look at pictures, the desks are fairly close together, and now they've got these plexiglass shields around each member, and they sort of each sit in their little box on the floor, and that's how they're meeting on the floor there. Arkansas didn't do that. They tried to get into one room and spread out some. They had a COVID outbreak in the House. I think the speaker got COVID. Everybody, I think, that I know of recovered, but it's the kind of thing that Texas is afraid of. I will say gently that if you look at the Texas legislature and you think about age and pre-existing conditions and things like that, you can see a lot of people in the legislature who would be susceptible to real danger here in a pandemic. So they're really mindful of that. They're trying to put together plans for that. It's still in flux, or I just tell you, here's how it's going to work. One of the first rule changes is going to be, it turns out that you can't deliberate or have certain kinds of hearings online in the Texas legislature. The rules don't allow it. Things have to happen in person. So I would expect that one of the first rule changes that they make is going to be some accommodation of software like Zoom and things like that to hold meetings. If you go back to redistricting for a moment, redistricting bills move slowly through a legislature and through the public. And without the pandemic, the legislative committees would have been holding hearings all over the state of Texas throughout the spring and summer and fall, getting people's opinions about, what's good and bad about their congressional, House and Senate districts, and how they think they ought to be changed. You're establishing a record of, how communities feel, how the community involvement is going, how communities of interest are split or held together. And all of this is important in drawing the maps, but it's really important in building the inevitable litigation that follows a legislature drawing maps. So when they go into a court and the court says, why'd you draw this way? One of the big pieces of evidence is, well, we talked to everybody in that area and they said the lines ought to work like this and not like that. You're building a case. So one of the questions for this legislature is going to be, how did you build your evidence of public opinion and public sentiment as you were doing redistricting? There are a million other things where you could do the same thing. You could do it on the budget, you could do it on public education, but redistricting is an easy way to think about what they're doing when they're trying to think about, how do we do these meetings? How do we hold these rules? How do we hear from the public? How do we proceed? Because of the pandemic, a lot of what happened or what happens in this legislative session is going to flow from the coronavirus. So first, you've got public response to the virus itself. How does Texas handle things like mask orders, the essential, non-essential business fight that we're going into again now? Our numbers have been peaking in Texas. They're now above the July levels. So our third wave of this disease at the moment is worse than either of the first two waves and rising. So the governor is back in that position of trying to decide, how much do you shut down? What do you do with masks? What do you do with this? What do you do with that? And a lot of legislators are, variously happy and unhappy about this or that part of the governor's orders so far, and about the powers of a governor to do this without legislative input. Greg Abbott's been operating on emergency powers since late March. Some legislators are bridling at that a little bit, and I expect that to be one of the big conversations. After you've talked about pandemic response, you have to talk about the recession that has resulted from the pandemic and pandemic response. So the economy is hurting, as you all know all too well. And so the state economy is hurting. The state's, the state's own revenue is down. Controller Glenn Hager said earlier this year that the current budget, which runs through the end of August, will be about $4.6 billion short of what he thought it would be. That much revenue that was supposed to come in isn't coming in, and the legislature is going to have to adapt to that. That turns out to be a fairly easy exercise, at least in the first piece, because we've got much more than that amount of money in the state's rainy day fund, its savings account. So you could, if you wanted to, and you were a legislator, just pull out a magic wand and say, okay, use the rainy day fund, cover that deficit or that shortfall, and let's go forward. The next piece of business is that Glenn Hager will estimate, the controller's office will estimate how much money will be coming in over the next 2 years, and the legislature will be writing a 2-year budget to fit that. That's expected to be a low number, and it puts the legislature in a position of cutting some spending, of doing some of its famous accounting tricks, or finding new money somewhere. And this is going to be, I think the animating exercise of this session. It's going to be very, very difficult to do. If you go back to 2019, and Fort Bend was one of the communities that really drove public sentiment on this, the legislature stepped in on public education. And one of sort of the big messages of that was the state's not paying enough of the share of public education. Too much of that is coming from local taxpayers. That's why property taxes are high. We need to change these formulas and rework this system. So they began the process of reworking the school finance formulas and committing the state to spending more on public education. And as they left that 2019 session, the economy was banging, everything was going great, but a lot of legislators were wondering about and worrying about how they were going to afford to meet their obligations, their new obligations on public education as they came into the 2021 session. Well, here we are, and we're not in a banging economy anymore. It's actually much better than a lot of other places, and Texas has done a pretty good job of weathering this so far. But still, you've got a cut in state revenue. You've got a new commitment to public education. You were going to have a strong commitment this time to doing some of the same things to higher education formulas. That might get put on hold. And you've got the prospect of making trimming some health and human services spending, which is difficult to do during a pandemic. That's exactly when a lot of those services are needed. So I think a lot of the conversation in this session is going to be, okay, how do we do this budget? What things are we doing now that we can cut? And if we had to do new revenue, where would we find it? The three things that I'm hearing the most about right now, not necessarily the things that they'll end up with, but there's been a lot of conversation about expanding Medicaid. This is a long-running conversation in Texas, all the way back to Governor Rick Perry saying, the federal government's offering this really attractive match on Medicaid spending. You put in a dime at the state level and the feds give you back $1. So that's, a 90-10 match. John Zerwas, who was representing your area in some measure, trusted Republican, his bona fides were great. The Republican Party didn't want to do this because of the strings attached to it. Zerwas tried to propose a plan. It didn't go anywhere, but I think that's going to be back. It brings a bunch of money in. A bunch of Republican states have jumped into Medicaid expansion. Missouri and Idaho, I think in this last election, voted to jump in, both really conservative states. And it's a way to put a bunch of money into a budget that clearly needs it. The people who run casinos in Las Vegas and elsewhere are hiring lobbyists like crazy right now. Now in Texas, this is always a kind of a two-pronged thing. If the casinos are coming to Texas, it either means that they want to start casinos in Texas, or that they want to make sure Texas doesn't open any casinos that would compete with, all the people flying to Las Vegas. It looks like they want casinos in Texas. And the pitch this time is, if you have gaming and you tax it, you can raise a bunch of money, all of that kind of stuff. So I think there's going to be a run at casinos. There's going to be a run at legalizing marijuana. A bunch of states have done this. It can be a source of tax revenue. The state is getting more and more liberal in its ideas about this. One of the things we polled for years is public sentiment on marijuana. And it turns out that, you know, I would have thought, or I did think going in, that you would have young people for it and old people against it. And old people were young people once, and it turns out not to be the case. And we've gradually gone on a 4-part question on marijuana. When we first started polling this a few years ago, most Texans were either in the category of marijuana should not be legal for any purpose, or marijuana should be legal for medical use. Now the majority, now more than 50%, say marijuana should be legalized for personal use or medical use in small amounts, or for any use in large amounts. There's a big cluster around personal use and medical use, but only 20% of Texans say it should never be legal. So public sentiment has changed. It's changed in other states. You know, how come Arizona can do it and we can't? And now you've got this push from the budget people saying, you know, you could tax that and raise a bunch of money. Something to watch as we go forward. One of the things that has been a long-running conversation in rural Texas and in some parts of urban Texas, and hasn't really gotten enough attention from the legislature, is broadband. There was a conversation, you know, a couple of years ago, if you said, we should expand broadband, it's part of the necessary infrastructure for this economy, you got a fair number of legislators saying, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea, we'll get to that. And you had a small number of loud people saying, why are we providing broadband so everybody can have Netflix? The pandemic has showed some other uses for broadband. This is how we educate our children. This is how we work. It's how we do a lot of medicine. And the places where we don't have access to high-speed broadband are really glaring now and are really a public policy problem, an economic problem, an educational problem for the state of Texas. So we're hearing a lot of attention to this, both in terms of getting parts of the state that are not currently wired, and to reduce the expense of places where they have access to broadband, but you know, they don't have $100 a month for high-speed internet or whatever it costs. So I think this is going to be a big topic of conversation and policy making during the legislative session. The other piece of it is if you have broadband for public education, what are you going to catch it on? The state spent a bunch of money on Chromebooks and tablets and things for kids to use for public education who didn't have them. You know, you could distribute through the schools, you know, largely on the basis of the school lunch programs and things. If someone was low income by those standards, they could maybe either get a subsidy or a free computer. Students who didn't qualify for those things could get a computer at the school's bulk rate. They're still working on all of that. And I think the first run at it was about $200 million that they used CARES money for. This is the federal program that followed the coronavirus. There may be some more CARES money. There may be some state money for this, but it's a big problem and it's getting a lot of conversation from the legislature. The powers and limits on law enforcement in light of the racial justice and social justice movements through the summer really animated, you know, a lot of demonstrations during the summer, and really became a big issue in this legislative session, or rather in the election that leads to the legislative session. The Republican messaging was around law enforcement, backing the police, back the blue, and this is a very politicized argument now. But I think it's going to get a lot of attention in the legislature and in Congress as we go forward. So a lot of the big storylines that you've been watching over the last months, I think, are going to surface as legislation here when the legislature gets together in January. So start with COVID, go to recession, go to the social justice, law enforcement stuff. There's probably going to be some conversation about climate and how do we prepare for, in Texas, it's going to be how do we prepare for hurricanes that are now showing up 2 at a time sometimes, and urban fire, which is a big problem in the Hill Country and, you know, the Austin area and some of the area between Houston and Austin and San Antonio. So there are a lot of those issues that you're kind of watching on TV every night and have been for months that are going to show up. Voting law is going to be a big argument if we ever get out of this election after we stop the litigation, certify everything, decide who won. There's going to be a Texas conversation about voting by mail and whether it should be expanded or abolished, whether you should have drive-by voting, how registration should work. all of those issues that you saw argued and litigated on the way to the election. The governor has raised bullet trains as an issue again. There was sort of a truce on this. There's a group that's been trying to get a bullet train okayed between the Houston area and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then maybe later between either of those two areas and Austin, San Antonio. It's about a $20 billion proposition. And the governor wrote a letter to the new Japanese prime minister saying, hey, welcome to your new job. Good luck with it. By the way, we're working with this Japanese company on high-speed rail in Texas, which I support. And a lot of rural legislators who were under the impression that the governor wasn't committed to that, and who for private property rights reasons and other reasons have been against this, were really surprised. And now that's ginning up a lot of activity. One of the conversations about how the legislature can meet has been around, COVID, and could you just come in to what's supposed to be 140 days of legislating, just do a budget, push some sunset bills off for 2 years, and pass 4 or 5 bills that you really need to get to, and then just go home. And then maybe come back in the summer and do redistricting. And, that's one of the conversations that's going on. So the question would be, which bills are those? What would the legislature do with redistricting? How does all of this work? How does this go forward? It's one of the ideas out there. So if you're worried about a sunset bill, I know 313 waivers and some of those things are up for sunset and are of concern to you guys. Some of that stuff might get put on hold, but keep an eye on it. The legislators have started filing bills. They range from the very serious to the not so serious. There's a there's a bill around the social justice and the killings, George Floyd bill, on the serious side. On the maybe it's serious to you side, there's a bill that would make the day after the Super Bowl a state holiday, so you wouldn't have to go to work. You could just lay there and get over it. The legislature does important things out here. And then you get to the regular news that we're in now. The Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is under investigation by the FBI. The allegations against him stem from a complaint that started with his top 8 assistants. 7 of them are lawyers. One of them was the head of enforcement. And they went on a whistleblower thing and said, we believe that the Attorney General has been acting on behalf of a political donor named Nate Paul, misusing his office and taking bribes. This is a real, has the potential of being a real bombshell. The Attorney General is in the middle of, it's one of those offices that's in the middle of everything. He's like a key individual in a redistricting legislative session. He's the state's top law enforcement officer. And if you go back to what I said a minute ago about 2022 starting, he's one of the main contestants should a higher office open up. There's an old joke in the political business and in state government business that AG stands for almost governor. The kind of governors in waiting, the Mark Whites and the Jim Maddoxes and, a lot of those people, Greg Abbott, a lot of those people are aching to move up. So we're all watching the Ken Paxton Square and curious about what's going to happen there and curious about what's going to happen in state government that way. We're done with a very tumultuous, noisy, sometimes ugly election. I think the legislative session is going to be a pretty serious section. I don't think that they have time or inclination right now for a lot of offbeat social legislation or, those kinds of things. They've got to worry about a budget. They've got to worry about a pandemic. And they've got to worry about sort of the meat and potatoes of running a state government. So with that, I think we've got a few minutes here for questions if you guys have some. I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Thank you, first of all, for that overview. And I'm sure there'll be some questions here. One of the things that seems mysterious to most of us is the redistricting process. And I'm not sure how it happens or what. I know it'll probably end up in court, but do you have a sense of the process? They got to wait for the census data to come out. That probably doesn't come out until mid or late session.
Right.
And then can you kind of take us through what happens there?
Sure. So the first thing that happens is the census shows there's this many people in each state, and you enter a piece of the process called reapportionment. This happens at the federal level, and they say, we're going to look at the population and divide the states proportionately, the 435 seats in Congress. A couple of rules: every state gets at least one member of Congress. So, you know, Wyoming's smaller than Fort Bend County in terms of population, but they get a congressman of their own. So you kind of go through that process. Texas is loosely expected to get 3 more congressional seats because we've grown faster than other states. Some states have shrunk. So that would take us to 39 seats from 36 now. The next piece is redistricting, which happens after they say, okay, your state gets this many people. Then the legislature comes in and divides the number of people in Texas by that reapportionment number. So say it's 39. Each of the districts has to have, for congressional purposes, the same number of people in it, or as close as you could possibly get to that. And they begin drawing maps that say this congressional seat is the same population as the next congressional seat, and so on and so on. And as they do that, they're also doing politics. You know, if I'm a Republican legislator or congressman, and I want to have my district be as Republican as I can get it, so I don't have to worry about Democrats in November. Democrats are doing the same thing. So that game begins. And it's sort of this weird, you know, multi-universe thing, because they're doing congressional lines at the same time they're doing the lines for the House and the lines for the Senate. And the way this actually works in the legislature is they see more members of Congress than they ever see any time in a decade, you know, coming down with their version of 10 cups begging for, hey, draw my map this way, don't draw my map that way. Could you make sure my opponent's in the next district? You know, all of those kinds of things. And the legislature doesn't, you know, I mean, the congressional maps are important, but they're not like existentially important to legislators. House members are worried about House maps. Senate members are worried about Senate maps. The sort of general rule, which gets violated pretty quickly, is that the House draws the House map, the Senate draws the Senate map. They both hold their nose and pass the other one's map. Because it's a Republican House and a Republican Senate, that's going to be easier than it would have been before. The congressional maps they'll draw, and as Jeff hinted in his question, this always goes to court. In fact, the litigation for the last maps is still open 10 years later. And then we'll have new elections based on those maps. So I expect the 2022 elections to go, you know, just a little bit of handicapping. Assuming Biden is the president, a midterm for a president often goes badly for the president's party. That makes it a Republican lean. It'll be the first election on Republican maps. That makes it a Republican lean. So I think the red Texas idea is going to be, you know, expect that to be the baseline for the 2022 elections. But they'll draw these maps and they kind of go off in secret, and they'll make a bunch of deals that you don't really see. But if you take maps apart, you can see that they actually do go down a street and they'll skip over across the street and take out somebody's house and then keep going down the street. It gets very, very detailed as they go along. And they're basically trying to maximize their chances of being elected or having their party elected.
Well, with Fort Bend County being one of the fastest growing counties in the state still, even at almost 1 million in population, we're going to be well over 900, I think, in the census roll. I've heard we might pick up as many as a couple additional state House seat representations. I don't know. I'm just curious how that process works. Same way, population distribution, and then obviously one of our desires in our legislative agenda is that a majority of the population of any Senate or House candidate or state House member is from Fort Bend population. We seemingly today have 3 Senate seats covering ours: Huffman, Colkhorst, and Miles. And I don't know that we have a majority of population in any of those. So when Fort Bend County has something that it really wants to get done, we don't capture the majority of any one of them to be able to do it. They're very good don't get me wrong, we have really good representation. And I understand that Joan Huffman might be the chairman of the redistricting committee in the Senate. So
right, she is now. I expect her to probably hold on to that.
Yeah. How about any other questions from the group? You can open your mic and ask Ross. We've got.
Jeff, I've got a question.
Okay.
Well, hey, Ross, this is Sugar Land Mayor Joe Zimmerman.
Sure.
Do you have any insight as to whether the legislature will go back after the cities and the counties and their ability to hire lobbyists to represent them?
Yeah, I think they're going to be coming after that. They are a Republican, like I said, it's a Republican legislature, and the Republican Party of Texas has an 8-point program for the legislature. I think, there are pieces of that the legislature will just flat ignore, and a couple of pieces that are dear to some of them. One of the things that's on that list is getting rid of taxpayer-funded lobbyists. So I expect that to be an argument. Again, there's sort of a running back and forth between, and has been for years, this is pre-COVID, probably the last 3 or 4 sessions, about the power of cities, the powers of the state government. It's been exacerbated or amplified by the responses to COVID. When can a city, this is the argument they're having in El Paso right now. When can a city or a county say, everybody stay home? We've got a real problem out here. And when does the state step in and say, no, you can't restrict people in that way? This taxpayer-funded lobbyist measure is going to be a piece of that fight. And I expect it to be back and probably be a hotly argued issue like it was last session.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because what I see is you have, and you alluded to it earlier, you talked about the fact that Texas virtually was red with the exception of the major cities. And that's really interesting on this legislation because they attempt to punish all the cities, many of which have Republican mayors, and limit our authority. So I find that just fascinating that they just kind of omit that really important piece, I think, to their own detriment, really.
Yeah, it's a running fight.
Yeah, thank you.
Jeff, there's a question in the chat about school districts and funding public education.
So they're going to fund it. That's, public education is one of the big things that the legislature does financially. Education and health and human services are the 2 biggest components of the state budget. As I said, they've made a new commitment in 2019 to public schools. The 2018 elections, which seems like 300 years ago, were animated by arguments about public school funding, about the state's share of funding, about increasing pressure on already high property taxes. I think the latest numbers I've seen, Texas is 6th in the country on property taxes, in the wrong race for the top, right? We have the 6th highest property taxes. And there's a lot of political pressure to fund that. And after the 2011 cuts that followed the financial crisis in 2008, legislators are pretty well aware that voters don't like it when they cut education spending. So this is one of the places where the budget becomes a difficult thing to negotiate. But they take public education seriously. They know their voters do, and they're just scrambling for the money.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat room. We have just another minute or so before this thing ends, but I want to thank you, Ross. It's always a pleasure. I think the media has gotten a bad rap, but sometimes it's deserved, particularly the national media and the way that they presented things, and the social media giants not being a platform but a publisher, as Ted Cruz said the other day. I think that's true. I think they are putting their finger on the scales. I think the Texas Tribune has done a pretty good job of calling balls and strikes, and I appreciate that, and we always like your input on that. I hope you stay that way, because what we really need is people to trust media, and we need people to call out problems on both sides, right? Equally. That's what you guys are there for, is to make sure that the process is fair and even-handed, and that we call out errors and problems when they exist. So keep doing a good job. We appreciate it. We'll always continue to have you back as you represent the best of that in our media. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate y'all. Thanks for having me.